Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today I'm going to give you some tips for RAM overclocking on Gigabyte motherboards with Ryzen, so AM4 motherboards from Gigabyte. So right now we're just in Windows, and this is Windows 7. Doesn't matter if you use Windows 10. I'm just using Windows 7 because this is, like, I have another copy of, like, I have a bunch of copies of Windows lying around, and this is the one I just, happen to have on hand. So well, not a bunch of copies of Windows. It's more like I have a bunch of hard drives with Windows on them, and this is just the one that happened to be in the system when I decided to do this. So there's a few programs you're going to want to have if you're doing RAM overclocking. So the first one, and this one's optional, you don't absolutely need it, is Typhoon Burner. It has a whole bunch of functionalities that we really don't care about. All we want is the ability to read the SPD on the memory stick. So the SPD is a chip on your memory stick, and it stores a whole bunch of information about your memory, like the XMP profile, JDEC profiles, RAM, like RAM chip revision, manufacturer, like a whole bunch of somewhat useful information. So we just read the SPD for the kit I have in the system right now. And we can see that we have a XMP profile down here for 4000 CL19. So yeah, this kit is meant to work on Z170, but hey, I wanted a 4000 CL19 memory kit, so here I have one. And it was relatively cheap, which is part of the reason why I went and got this. So what's important here is that you can check your DRAM components right here. So first things first, your manufacturer. So this is made by Samsung, and technically you can tell all of, like, everything that's right here, you can tell that from the part number, but since the program does this for us, this is a 4 gigabit memory chip, eDie, from Samsung. So this is Samsung eDie memory. There's also BDie from Samsung, and there's DDie as well, for DDR4. Sometime in the future we should start seeing CDie revisions, so yeah, that's somewhere in the future. I have no idea how that'll overclock. It isn't available yet. It has just recently entered mass production. So this kit's an eDie kit, and that basically, and the reason why you want to know this is it will tell you some basics, well, not basics, but it'll give you some idea of how you need to set up the memory in order for it not to complain a little bit. So yeah, if you were on BDI, then you overclock it a bit differently. If you're on Hynix and AFR and ADI or MDI, again, it overclocks a bit differently. Unfortunately, I've not tried any Hynix memory, so I have literally no idea how that behaves with Gigabyte motherboards on Ryzen. But I have tried EDI and BDI, and right now we're on EDI. So here's some basic guidance for, which actually this applies to like most motherboards right here. Is if you have EDI, you're going to want to set, like for these speeds, you're going to want to set timings in these ranges. And everything's a range because RAM overclocking is just like nothing's set in stone. There's general guidelines, but there's like the Silicon Lottery applies as usual. Then there's also variants in like SPD programming, motherboard support, RAM manufacturer, like the PCB layout they use also affects memory overclocking as well. So, you get a really big range of settings that can work and won't necessarily work. So the general rule for EDI is that you'll find it on 4 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte sticks because it's a 4 gigabit IC, which Typhoon Burner told us. So that means you can have, like, a 4 gigabyte stick has 8 chips on one side. That's 4 gigabytes because it's 4 gigabits and you get 8 chips. So, 8 times 4 gigabits is 4 gigabytes. And then if you have an 8 gigabyte stick, you actually have memory chips on both sides, and the stick is dual ranked. Dual ranked memory kits clock worse than single ranked memory kits. This is true across the board. Even on Intel systems, if you have a dual ranked memory kit, it won't clock as high as a single ranked memory kit. However, dual ranked memory does have slightly high, has better performance per clock. ultimately, you can outclock, like, if you fine-tune a single rank kit, you can probably outclock the advantage of being dual ranked. But dual ranked memory does get better performance at lower speeds because you essentially have, well, it basically interleaves the memory access a little bit. So it's not quite the same difference as like going from single channel to dual channel, but it does, the memory controller can access one rank of memory, and then while that rank is doing its thing, it can go and send a command to the next rank of memory. So it is a bit faster. Not hugely so. Like dual channel, it's literally parallel. Dual rank is just interleaved a bit. So yeah, and it does put more strain on the memory controller. Either way, in terms of timings, what you're going to want to do with eDie is that, so eDie is, has a bit of a property that basically your cast latency can be pretty low, and your cast latency actually scales with voltage, but you're never going to, like, you know, if you were pushing really high voltages into eDie, like say 1.8 volts, and you were on an Intel system, you could probably get the cast latency all the way down to like cast 13 at 4,000 megahertz, or 12, or even, well, 12 is probably about around the limit. But you could do totally do CL12 at like 1.9 volts, 4,000 megahertz if you had the right, you know, Intel system. Now on AMD, you're not going to do that, and you're certainly not going to be pushing that much voltage for daily usage because, well, it's unsafe. AMD basically recommends a maximum of 1.5 volts VDIM. I'll show you where to set that in the BIOS, but basically with those kinds of, like, up to 1.5 volts, you're going to be looking at cast latencies for 2933. Some kits, like my kit here, can run 14. It can do CL14, but I imagine there's going to be worse kits out there that might end up doing only 16. Also, depending on the motherboard, you might get stuck at 16. 3066, some kits can do some kits probably do 14, some probably can probably do 16 or 15. Really depends on chip variants. And then for 3200, you're going to be looking at 15 to 17. My kit right here on my better Ryzen chip, so I actually have two Ryzen 7s, and this second one is terrible. My other Ryzen can do like 3200 megahertz with eDie at CL 16, 16, 16, and it runs great. This one, not so much. And then 3333, you're going to be looking at 15 to 17 for your cast latency, and what, you know, between those two. And then 3466, you're going to be looking at like 16 to 18 at acceptable voltage levels. Now, where eDie is kind of a bit problematic is it has it needs a really loose TRCD and TRP. So your TRCD is just going to get kind of ridiculous. For example, at like my kit right here for 3200 megahertz, I can run 16, 16, 16. When I bumped that up to 33, 33, I had to loosen out the timings to 16, 18, 18 in order to have that work. And then 3466, which I could also do, required like 16, 20, 20. So the TRCD and the TRP go up really, really quickly, whereas the CL tends to stay a bit tends to stay pretty low. It's not as good as BDI. BDI definitely beats it on outright timings, but it's, you know, basically on eDie, your TRCD and TRP, you need to set them higher. Most of the time, you just need to set them higher. So a really good starting point when you're overclocking an eDie memory kit is to just set all the timings to 18, 18, 18, and then start tightening them down once you find out what frequency you're kind of maxing out at. So, yeah. And for TRAS, so TRAS kind of goes all over the place. You can set it, like, especially on Ryzen, like on Intel platforms, like mainstream Intel, like Kaby Lake and Skylake, and I think Coffee Lake as well, and maybe Skylake X, I'm not sure, I've not tested, and I've not read it either, but this is an AMD guide. On AMD systems, you can put the TRAS basically anywhere between 20 and 40, and you could technically go past 40 as well, but it costs you, like, the higher your timings you lose performance, the higher they are. So, you know, 40, I would say, is kind of like a last resort. And the TRAS, you know, you can set it to pretty much whatever is stable. So you'll want to test. And a good starting point, I'd say, you can start at 40 and just work it down. You can probably start at 36 and work it down from there as well. You probably don't need to set it to 40 in order to get whatever frequency you're aiming for. Now, So that's eDie. You know, the timings aren't exactly spectacular, but it's nothing. It's not too bad. Now BDie, you can find that on 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte memory sticks. The surefire way to find a BDie memory kit is 3200 megahertz CL14. There's literally no other memory IC out there which will run that. As you can see, I mean, eDie I have spec'd for like 15 at best, because I've not heard like at voltages that the manufacturers would actually ship. So like 1.35, 1.4, 1.45, which is the XMP voltage range. Nobody's going to ship a 3200 CL14 eDie kit or Hynix kit. Is not possible. Those chips can't do it. 3466 CL16, same deal. I mean, technically, I think an eDie kit could probably hit CL16, but it'd have to be dual ranked, and at that point, it might not. In order to be an 8 gigabyte stick. So 3466 C16 is a safe bet. 3600 C16 is a safe bet as well. 3733 C18 is a safe bet. 3866 C18 is a safe bet. And then 4000 plus at CL19 is also 100% safe. So those are pretty much all of the safe memory speed bins. If it's rated either high, like if you have a cast latency that's higher for a given speed than what I have listed here, it's probably doable. Like those kits could end up with Hynix chips, because the main difference between BDie and Hynix ADie or MDie is that MDie and ADie don't clock as good for given timings. So, you know, to do like CL18, well, at CL18, for example, you can do AFR could do 3600 easy. That wouldn't be a problem for AFR to do. So you could, if you're buying a 3600 CL18 kit, there's a small chance you might end up with AFR, and you really don't want to, like, that would be bad, because you're spending like a lot of money on a 3600 megahertz kit, and if you end up with terrible memory chips, you're never going to run it anywhere near that speed. So yeah, keep that in mind. Similarly, if you're buying a 3200 megahertz kit, please, like, do yourself a favor and buy a 3200 megahertz CL14, because if you're buying a 3200 megahertz CL16 kit, it'll probably, if it's AFR, from what I've heard, it'll probably end up stuck around 3066 megahertz, at which point you could have just bought yourself a CL15 3000 megahertz rated kit, which would also probably be AFR and cost a bit less, probably. Lots of probablys here, but, you know, it's just, can't test everything. And, well, could test everything, is just RAM is, there's too much. So, yeah. Now on BDie, in terms of timings, at 2933 megahertz, you're going to be looking at a CL of 13 to 15. And the TRCD and the TRP on BDie are kind of, like, it's pretty unique to BDie. There's no other memory IC I'm aware of that does this. You can set the TRCD and, well, actually, no. Some Micron memory chips can do the same thing that BDie does, but Micron memory doesn't clock as high. But for BDie, you can do things like your TRCD and TRP being one lower than your CL, and it'll be completely stable. Whereas on, say, well, eDie, that won't even post. You know, if your CL is as low as it goes and you set your TRCD below it, it probably won't post at all. BDie will actually run just fine if you have a kit that's capable of doing that. So at 2933, you could run things as aggressive as like 13, 12, 12, 12, maybe 28 for TRAS. The TRAS, again, you can get it pretty damn low. I saw somebody who managed to get a TRAS of 22 working through like intense memory stress testing. So yeah, it is... you know, TRAS has a massive range, and then on BDie is just, yeah, you can work it way down. So, yeah, and same rule applies just going up, you know. By 3600 megahertz, honestly, I don't think going for 3600 is worth it for most people. Basically because I imagine some CPUs will just not have the memory controller to do it at good memory timings. And if your cast latency ends up at like CL18, it's just not worth it. Like, it really isn't. You'd be better off at like 3466 16, or, you know, maybe 3200 CL14 and then 13 TRCD and 13 TRP. That's actually not that hard to do. 3200 14 14 14. That's also a, you know, easy, like for B-die, that should be a pretty easy speed to hit. Though, you know, if your chip just has a terrible memory controller like this one does, then you might end up running 16, 16, 16 because, well, there's not much you can do about it. So that's kind of like the general guidelines for B-die and E-die in terms of timings. On E-die, basically, your TRCD and TRP end up being really, really high. On B-die, your TRP and TRCD can be lower than your CAS latency, depending on the quality of your sticks. Like, if you have good sticks, then they'll do it. So, yeah, that's the kind of timings you're going to be looking at for the primaries. The next thing you're going to want is CPU-Z. You're going to want CPU-Z because CPU-Z well, Hardware Info 64 also works, but CPU-Z is just like, we use it on HWBot all the time, so it's just go-to utility. It loads faster than Hardware Info, so that's my argument. You can check your memory overclock if your memory clock's actually stuck, which, you know, that's a little quirk with the, well, a lot of well, I think it's unique to Gigabyte where the board will fail to post and then it'll just reset your memory clock and it won't actually change any of your other settings, which I think is a pretty cool thing. It's just annoying once you get into Windows and find out you're at 2133. Either way, CPU-Z is a good way to check your primary timings as well as your frequency. And then what you're also going to want is Ryzen Timing Checker. This is a program made by an overclocker named the Stilt. He makes like so much awesome software for AMD overclockers. Like he made a bit of software for the Bulldozer architecture, which removed a hardware restriction on running, well, not hardware, but it removed a restriction on the CPUs from running x87 code in a like faster way. And it made like a huge difference for certain benchmarks. So as well as he has put out P-state overclocking utilities and a whole bunch of other really handy tools for AMD overclockers. This is another one of them. Ryzen Timing Checker. It basically lets you check all your sub timings. So you get your, you get your primaries up here. It also lets you check a bunch of the like other settings like the gear down mode. If you have bank group swap, bank group swap, which I think that one's channel interleaving, and that one I think might be rank interleaving. Command rate, and all of your sub timings. And you're probably going to want to write these down as you're overclocking. So, a piece of paper tends to be handy as well, because you can't open screenshots of settings in the middle of the BIOS, unfortunately. So, yeah, but this is really handy for like checking your actual memory sub timings. So you'll want that as well. And then when it comes to actual memory stability, you'll want something like memtest. So here I have the Pro version. Basically, you start it, and it will, I'll open up, it will, well, give it a second. We gotta wait. There, it'll chew up all of the available memory on your system, and it will go through the memory and check for any, it'll basically just copy data around in and out of your memory, and it will check for any mistakes that are made in the process. And basically, basically it's a memory stress test, so that's what it does. In terms of using it, you're going to want, like, the gold standard for memory stability is when all of these instances, so basically, because of how Windows works, every single one of these instances uses only something like 3.5 gigabytes of memory, and each of them is single-threaded as well. So if you actually want this test to run faster, instead of just pressing start test, you'd want to open up a bunch of instances and, set your memory usage in each of them manually. So I'll actually show you how you would do that. So we have 3 instances right here. So I'd set like 2 gigabytes that one, 2 gigabytes that one, and then I want a few more instances, so let's go. 2 more gigabytes on that one, and that's 6. So, we'll start that one, that one, that one, and that one. And basically, these 3 together use up 6 gigs of memory. This one uses up whatever's left over. Each of them runs on a single thread, and they basically just go through the memory and check for any errors. When all of your instances show 1,000% completion, you can consider yourself like bulletproof levels of stable. But, you know, if you don't want to sit here forever, because this does take a while, especially if you have like 32 gigabytes of memory, checking 32 gigabytes of memory takes a lot of time. So, you know, if you don't want to sit there forever, you can, you know, you can let it run for like maybe 500% instead of 1,000%. But the longer you let it run, the better. And in terms of how many errors you want to see 0 errors. Your memory should not be making any errors under normal operating conditions at all. So even if it's not like error correcting or anything, you really shouldn't be getting memory errors. If you are getting memory errors, even just 1 in every 100%, your RAM's unstable. So you should either dial the clock back or do something about it. So yeah, that's MemTest. There's also a free alternative because the MemTest Pro actually costs $5 if I remember correctly. So it's really cheap. But if you want a completely free memory testing program, there is MemTest 86, which is I think it's like a bootable USB. You can put it on a bootable USB and basically it will run like, you know, it'll boot into that and it'll run through all of your RAM. Because MemTest, the version I just used, it is limited to not checking the part of the RAM which the operating system is using for itself. So, you know, if that 500 megabytes of memory, because, you know, ultimately I can't check for any errors in that 522 megabytes that Windows needs just to run here. You know, if there's any errors in that, that's pretty bad. But, you know, if the rest of your RAM passes 1,000%, then the probability that, you know, the part that Windows just so happens to use has a bunch of errors is pretty unlikely. So, yeah. And also, probably before doing your memory testing, you're going to want to run a CPU stress test because memory overclocking improves CPU performance. That's the whole bloody point, right? It makes it possible for your CPU to do more work. And since your CPU is doing more work, there is a chance it might have gotten unstable. So you're going to want to do a CPU stress test as well. You can use Prime 95 or Intel Burn Test, AVX Edition, or whatever, like Realbench or whatever other, you know, stress testing utility you prefer. But definitely you want to do a CPU stress test as well. I personally, if you're just doing like, you know, intermediate checks, I would do like a quick run of a CPU test just to make sure that, you know, it doesn't crash in the first 10 minutes, then run MemTest. Then do like a longer CPU test and then I'll leave MemTest overnight. So yeah, stress testing a memory overclock is just a massive bloody pain. Anyway, let's go into the BIOS. Which I should probably reset it. So, yeah, you know what? I'll reset it. So I'll just shut down. Oh, and you should learn how to reset on Gigabyte motherboards. You really, like, go check the motherboard manual on how to reset your motherboard. You don't necessarily always need to pull the battery. Okay, yeah, pulling the CMOS battery does wipe the BIOS. But there's also on, say, the Gigabyte Gaming K5, right above your front panel headers, there is a BIOS reset jumper. There's 2 pins. If you short them together, it resets the BIOS. If you're doing memory overclocking, or, well, really any kind of overclocking, you really should know how to reset your BIOS. Because even though Ryzen has like a built-in system for recovering from bad memory settings, for some reason it doesn't seem to be working very well on Gigabyte boards. Though on the ASRock Taichi I've also been able to get the board to get stuck in a boot loop. So it's not like Gigabyte's the worst at it, but I have noticed that I'm using the reset pins a bit more than I would consider normal. So let's get into settings, Starting with voltages. So you're going to need, like, the voltages you're going to need for memory overclocking are your V-core, because as I said, your CPU core stability may or may not change. You know, it might get worse. If, like, once you crank up the memory speed, your memory core stability might go down, so you're going to want to, you know, you're going to be using the V-core a bit, but what you actually set, like, I've done a CPU overclocking guide, just use that guiding. The next thing is the V-core SoC. So the SoC is everything on Ryzen that isn't the cores or the memory PHYs or the, like, well, there's a few bits of the chip that aren't part of the SoC, but basically everything else is the SoC, and that includes the Infinity Fabric and, like, a good chunk of the memory controller. So you're gonna want, so in some cases you're gonna want to crank up the voltage on that. Unfortunately, well, basically the SoC voltage can have a sweet spot. So just pushing just raising the SoC voltage will not necessarily help you with stability. Okay. This voltage right here doesn't actually do anything for, well, this voltage generally won't do anything for stability, though you can tweak it up and down a bit. Honestly, I would recommend that you just leave it alone. Maybe bump it up by plus 20 millivolts, but it really, generally speaking, it shouldn't actually help your stability at all, that one. Your V-core SoC, it's a offset voltage, which is why we're going to get back to that in terms of actually setting the voltage there. But for your SoC voltage, you don't want to exceed 1.2 volts, and you don't have a say on the minimum voltage with Gigabyte motherboards, unfortunately, and I will show you that shortly. DRAM voltage. AMD advises no more than 1.5 volts DRAM, so don't go over that. Then there is DDR VPP voltage. This sits at 2.5 volts auto. That's where it's supposed to be. Generally speaking, tweaking this one doesn't do anything, but you might want to, like, in some cases, it might help to bump it up to, like, 2.6, 2.65, and you don't really want to go in excess of that. But generally speaking, it really, like, it doesn't help. It really doesn't help. So I personally don't touch that voltage at all, because I've never actually seen it help me. I have heard other people who said that, you know, yeah, I tweaked it and it improved stability, but I've never run into that situation yet. Then we have the DRAM termination voltage. This is normally going to be half your DRAM voltage. So if we set this to, well, actually 0.75, 1.5. So, okay, well, that screwed up there. That's what it should be on auto. Well, actually, let's see what happens. Yeah, okay. So basically, this voltage should all be half your DRAM voltage, but tweaking it up or down, again, like basically with everything memory related, there's probably a sweet spot at which it works better than at any other voltage level. So there is, you know, tweaking it up or down can improve stability. For this E-die kit specifically at 1.5 volts, on my other Ryzen 7 chip, not this one, I've not checked if it's the same for this one. It can change depending on what CPU you have. You know, this E-die kit likes to have the termination at 0.8 volts for 1.5 volts. This voltage you do not want to exceed 0.95 volts at all. It's unsafe for the lifespan of your CPU if you go past 0.95. But probably you're not going to go outside of a range of, say, plus minus 50 millivolts around half your DRAM voltage. So basically at 1.5 volts, anything between 0.7 and 0.8, that should probably be the range in which you find stability. Going below that or even above that can sometimes help. It's just generally going that far away from half doesn't, like, in my experience, doesn't actually help you at all and can actually cost you stability. So yeah, keep that in mind. You know, 1.4 volts, you'd have 0.7, and so up to 0.75 down to 0.65. You get the idea. There's a range for these. So I'll just leave that. Well, I'm not going to leave that. Well, let's just start off with like, let's just start right off with 1.5. And I'll just leave that at 0.8, because ultimately we're not going to go through the whole stress testing procedure here, because it's just like, it takes hours, literally hours. So just going to set the voltages up like that. And now we're going to go to the advanced memory settings. If you're not on Samsung B-Die, or even if you are on Samsung VDI, there's really no good reason to keep gear down mode enabled, so just disable it. You're going to put your memory timing mode in advanced manual. Your starting timings, I recommend, you know, you really do start with just like 18, 18, 40, or, well, 36 would also work. And quite frankly, 36 is probably going to work, well, not necessarily better, but it's like, I've not seen 40 help, whereas 36 tends to be like, you know, a good start, like, is also a good starting point. But 18, 18, 18, or as I said, also 20, 20, 20, 40 also works as a starting point. So we're going to start with some pretty loose timings. We're going to leave everything under, well, not everything. These are all your secondaries, right? TRC down to TFAW, those are your secondaries. You can check those from the timing, or Ryzen timing checker, which we went over in the OS. Down here we have command rate. For most memory sticks, well, if it's BDI, it can probably do 1T, but depending on your motherboard, your CPU, and your memory kit, you might end up having to run 2T. Obviously, higher means less performance for timings, because basically all of these timings basically describe in clock cycles how long it takes for something in the RAM to happen. So, for example, TRFC, which this is the RAM refresh cycle. Well, actually, isn't it row refresh? No, refresh cycle. It's just refresh cycle. That's what the R is for. Bloody. Can't. I don't keep track of these very well. So the refresh cycle is basically your RAM basically needs to refresh, because the way DRAM cells work is there's basically a tiny capacitor, and, you know, the voltage level of that capacitor is a stored binary value. So the problem with capacitors is they discharge over time. They're not, well, batteries also would slowly, you know, maybe discharge over time, I guess. But capacitors definitely do it at a relatively rapid rate. So your memory has the refresh cycle where basically it just refreshes all of the capacitors to their correct voltage levels, because if you didn't do that, they would like just lower and lower and lower until eventually everything on the memory turns into 0 again. So that's what the refresh cycle is for. And generally speaking, motherboards will set this high on automatically. Like, they'll set it into the 400 plus range, depending on what frequency you're at. You don't need it that high. Anywhere between, like on BDI, you can push it as low as 200 range. But on most other memory ICs, and I keep hitting an arrow key on this bloody keyboard, and then it jumps. But you can drop it all the way down to 200 ranges, you know, like 200, 220, 240 on BDI, but most other memory ICs, you're going to end up around 300. If you're struggling with stability, you might want to go up to 400. If you're aiming for really high clock speed for whatever reason, set it to 600, because what I have noticed is this motherboard is, like the Gigabyte board, like the Taichi sets the TRFC ridiculously high on its own. The Gigabyte boards set it at like the 400 range, which is like, that's actually acceptable. The problem is if you're trying to go for some really high frequency, you know, high frequencies, it costs you stability. The refresh cycle, while the RAM is refreshing, it can't actually do anything. You know, it's busy refreshing. It can't pass data. So the refresh cycle, like the longer your refresh cycle is, the more cycles you dedicate to refreshing the memory, the less performance you get, which is why actually for high frequency attempts, you set it super high, because it basically means the memory doesn't pass as much data and there's less chance for you to crash. But yeah, so that's the refresh cycle. You don't, like, if you set it super high, it costs you performance. If you set it super low, it'll crash on you. But generally around the 300 range works for most memory ICs at around 3200 megahertz. So we're going to set that back to auto. Well, actually, yeah, we'll just leave that back to auto. The board doesn't really screw that up. Then TRTP, the board can deal with that one on its own. TFAW, so that's for activate window. That one tends to be set a little bit high by most motherboards. You can probably lower that, but, you know, if you don't want to mess with it and you want to save some time, just leave it auto. TCWL tends to be set a bit high. TWR tends to be set a little bit high. TRC is set pretty high. TRC has a special rule. Your TRC cannot be less than your TRP plus your TRAS. So if your TRP is 18, or actually a simpler example, if that was 20 and that was 40, this can be like TRC can be no lower than 60, because if it's lower than 60, it costs you stability. Like it will literally just spit out errors. And I accidentally had the TRAS at like 56 once, and TRC was at like 70 something. It was really bad. It was spewing out errors, and I was wondering what on earth I did wrong. And it happened that the TRAS was super high, and the TRC was too low because the motherboard doesn't actually follow that rule. Surprise, surprise. Actually, it was in like the 70s range. Well, now I can't remember what the motherboard screwed up. Well, either way, like I had the TRAS too high and the TRP really high, and then the TRC was just like changing TRAS fixed the problem, and basically it's generally that it was probably because the TRC was being set too low automatically. So TRC above your TRP plus TRAS. So, you know, for 1836, your minimum value would be like 54. So, yeah. And you can actually notice on the... this BIOS. Well, you can actually notice on the right column right here, 51 is equal to 36 plus 15. So actually just setting it to TRP plus TRAS is like the easiest way to get maximum performance without like huge instability issues. However, if your TRP and your TRAS are really, really low, your TRC can actually not be able to like match them, add it up. So like basically TRC below 40 for, well, when I was doing some testing, I like going below 39 TRC was just straight up impossible, even though the TRP and the TRAS were like 11 and 28. Or it was actually, no, I had like 12. My timings were basically 12, 11, 11, 26. Yeah, and so you'd think, okay, I can set the TRC to 37 for that. Nope. TRC had to be at like 40-ish for stability reasons. So, yeah, below 40, it probably won't work even if your TRP and TRAS are low enough. There's probably no reason to go that low anyway. So, yeah. Then we have TWR, which I already mentioned, TCWL as well. TRRDS, TRRDS and TRRDL as a really basic rule of thumb, if you keep them one apart, so like 8 and 9, that generally gives you the best stability. It does cost, like, well, it doesn't give you the best stability, but it's an easy way of keeping them stable. And what I have noticed is like this board, it seems to like, it likes to, like, it raises the RRDL, really quick, and it doesn't really raise the RRDS quickly as much. So I had one case where at like 33 megahertz it was at 4.9, which bumping that up to I think 8.9 stabilized that completely. But that was on a different chip, and I think the same memory sticks though. But yeah, this board tends to set the TRRD a little bit low. Your Gigabyte board might do that as well, so you know you might need to raise that one. TWTRS, similar story as the TRRDS. It, like, for some reason, the board just insists on keeping these two around 4 and 5. Like, actually, yeah, it was like, it auto-timed not like 4.9, 4.12, and, well, that doesn't work. So I ended up having to bump the underscore S ones up a bit, so for stability reasons. So, yeah, but again, your mileage may vary on that. Now then, processor on-die termination. So there's resistors on your CPU to terminate all the signaling, and you can adjust what amount of resistance they have. Anything over sort of 68.6 ohms is too much. Like, it can be harmful for the CPU. So you don't want to go over that. Really, you should probably just stick to 60 ohms, and not, well, I have had some like I had one motherboard during one session where as I was lowering the CAS latency, I also had to lower the on-die termination. So I ended up at like CAS12 with a proc with the on-die termination at like 40. But generally speaking, most motherboards just like it best if you set it to 60 ohms and don't and leave it at that. That tends to work best. But again, you might want to try the lower values as well, because there is a sweet spot for your there might be a sweet spot for your specific memory configuration. TRC page, don't ever mess with, like, leave that one on auto. I've not noticed a reason to mess with that one. These TRDWR, TRDR, like, you can just leave the board to do these on its own. TCKE, you might want to tweak this one down, as it tends to get a little bit high unnecessarily. And then the RTTs, no idea what to do with those. So you're going to want to leave those on auto. Unfortunately, yeah, I really am not the world's best RAM overclocker. It's just, you know, hopefully what I've shared so far, like, what I've shared so far should help you in most cases, because I have managed to get 3200 megahertz and even 3333 completely stable on E-die. Funnily enough, this CPU right now that's in the system doesn't like B-die very much compared to, like, the E-die. Well, actually, it doesn't seem to like anything very much. This one just sucks compared to my other chip. So, yeah. Well, that's the kind of thing you want to do for timings. But when you're just starting out, you know, you want to set your primaries pretty loose, your command rate to 2, your processor on-die termination to 60, and not touch anything else. Gigabyte boards are special because they allow you to tweak the timings for each memory channel separately. You know, if you want to do twice as much work, if you want to type in twice as many settings and stress test twice as many different configurations, knock yourself out. Same rules apply, just, you know, a whole second channel of you for you to mess with. I really don't think that's worth it. If you just configure all of your settings for channel 1, it will automatically apply the same settings to channel 2, if you just leave channel 2 on auto. So, you know, no need to manually enter all the values here. Now then, the last setting here, well, no, not last setting. Up here you get your memory multiplier. And, you know, it goes from 1333 all the way up to 40. I've had limited success on this motherboard with, well, on the other CPU, I had 3333 working, great. 3466 also worked. It was really unstable, but it worked. But this chip here only works around 3200, which, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll be able to fine-tune it into working at the higher ones, but right now, setting it above 3200 doesn't post at all, so, yeah. But we're going to start off at 2933 for now, because that is, like, 2933, even on, like, high NICs and a ton of RAM, so, like, 32 gigs of RAM, shouldn't have too much trouble posting. So we're going to start at 2933. Though you might want to, like, depending on your memory kit, if you're on, like, well, I have one memory kit that didn't really work above 2400 either. So in those cases, you might actually want to start at 2666. But for most configurations, starting at 2933 should be fine. If the system doesn't post, go all the way down to, like, 2400 or 2666. But unless you're running, like, 4 DIMMs or... well, 4 DIMMs or like 16 gigabyte memory sticks, or, you know, some really high capacity configuration, you won't really need to go, like, you shouldn't need to start that low. And even then it should work at 2933. Now, the last setting left to deal with, well, these you can leave the board to deal with those on its own. You don't need to worry about those. Your XMP profile, well, the reason I'm not using this is because this memory kit is rated for 4000 megahertz, so yeah. If you have a memory kit that's rated at 3200 megahertz and CL14, it'll probably work. If you have a kit rated at anything over 3200 megahertz, you probably want to manually set everything up. So, yeah. CLDO VDDP. This is a bit of a special voltage. It powers a portion of the memory controller in Ryzen. This one is really finicky. It is built into the CPU. It requires a cold restart, like, you need to fully restart the entire system for this voltage to apply. You do not want to exceed more than 1050 on it. So this is this voltage regulator is built into the CPU, so you can actually set, 1 millivolt voltage accuracy, which is pretty neat. But yeah, you want to fine tune this one. And this one can move around memory holes. It can move, memory holes, that might actually be why this chip is having such a ridiculously hard time booting 3333, as in not booting it at all. It just has a hole there. My other chip boots 3333 fine, so, that's why I'm complaining about this one. But if you're having trouble with like a specific memory speed, even just posting, then adjusting the CLDO VDDP up and down can help. So, don't go past 1050. You're probably going to find a sweet spot somewhere between 800 and 1000 for this one. And that sweet spot may move depending on what your memory settings end up being. So this setting is kind of annoying. Because, yeah, and very fine, small changes to this one can also make a huge difference. So I'd recommend, if you're testing this one, increment in like 10 or 5 millivolts. Don't jump on it. Go slow with this one, and it can help you a lot. It's a very powerful tool. It's just kind of annoying because it has a sweet spot and it's so granular. So you need to do a lot of testing with this one. But for now, we're just gonna leave that right on auto. Bam. So let's back out of there, and we're just going to put the CPU out of the minimum P state. Also on the K5 and the K3 motherboards from Gigabyte, as well as the K7, you'll have CPU clock control right here. This is BCLK. You can use it to fine-tune your memory and CPU overclock. Go slow with this thing. And actually, for daily usage, you do not want to exceed really around 104.5 megahertz. For me, going over 104.5 megahertz doesn't work at all. I can't post with higher speeds than that. I assume that's because the PCIe speeds on this motherboard aren't being configured properly, and I have manually tried to set the motherboard to PCIe 1.0, and I still couldn't go any higher for the BCLK to post. From the OS, you can actually raise the BCLK as much as you want, but yeah, for posting, you're probably not going to manage it above 104. 104.5. However, it does give you a 4.5% adjustment range for your CPU and memory clock. So, if you really want to fine-tune your memory, you want to run 3400 megahertz because 3466 doesn't work, you can do 102.2 and dial it down, and there. Now you have 3400 megahertz. And then if, you just want to keep your CPU clock in line relative to the CPU speed, the memory speed. So if you had before, you had like a 3.9 gigahertz overclock, yeah, you can actually still hit it with that BCLK, but at 103, you might run into the issue of, yeah, that's too high, that's too low. So you can sort of, you can really fine-tune your settings using the CPU clock control here. The thing is, it is like a stability black hole, potentially, and it may not play well with M.2 SSDs. So, if you have M.2 SSDs, you probably don't want to mess with it. If you're doing, but GPUs don't complain about it in general. Sound cards and video capture cards, I'm not sure. They might complain, but GPUs don't really mind that much. And it does give you some extra PCIe bandwidth, just by the way, it does do that. So, but it doesn't it doesn't have a huge performance improvement over, it doesn't really give you a noticeable performance improvement over, just having it at 100 and increasing the CPU clock to whatever speed you want. But it is useful if you're really trying to eke out the last couple megahertz out of whatever you're doing. Either way, I'm not going to set the CPU that high for now. And, well, the only thing we haven't set is the dynamic vCore SoC. So, and there's a reason for that. You see this voltage right now. It's at 0.88. When we restart with 20, well, let's go back down to 2933 or we won't be starting. You'll notice that the SoC voltage actually goes up on its own. And destroy that delete button. Anyway, we're now... Why are we... Okay, wait. Yeah, so we're at 2933. The BIOS speed reporter here is kind of inaccurate. It'll read like 20 megahertz above whatever speed you set most of the time. So yeah, once you go into the OS and check with CPU-Z, it'll report properly. But yeah. So now if we go into PCL status, you'll notice our vCore is now, well, our SoC voltage down here is at 1.1 volts. This is 1.1 volts on a lot of CPUs can be plenty to run all the way up to like 3400 or even 3600. Really depends on your CPU. For other chips, you might want to set it anywhere between 1.1 and 1.2. Don't go above 1.2, I mentioned that before. Going over 1.2 will degrade your memory, will degrade the system on a chip portion of your Ryzen CPU, and those things are the memory controller, the USB controller, the SATA controller, the PCIe. Like literally everything on your CPU that isn't the CPU core can die if you exceed 1.2 volts, can degrade. And then if it degrades, you're going to just have random instability issues all the time. So pushing a lot of vCore SoC, really not a great idea. The other thing is the SoC voltage has a sweet spot as well. So you'll want to find that, and you'll just want to stick with that for whatever memory settings you end up running. So yeah, so now we booted 2933. Let's see if we can, well, we will boot 3200. I'm like 99% sure we should be able to boot 3200. It's going to bump up the SoC a little bit. I've noticed that this chip specifically doesn't seem to appreciate very high SoC voltages. My other one works best at like 1.18. This one doesn't like that much voltage, so keep that in mind. Mileage may vary for literally every single setting. So, yeah. That's why I said this is not a guide, because basically I'm just telling you, okay, you can tweak this, you can tweak that, you can also tweak this. You don't need to tweak this one doesn't do anything. That's literally all I'm doing here, so. And we posted. That's all good. Now we're at 3200 megahertz memory clock. And, well, just for the hell of it, I'm going to loosen this out, because this is E-die. And we're going to see if we can do 3333. I really doubt it, but maybe. Oh, come on, this hasn't worked all bloody day, and now it does? I hate RAM. I really hate RAM. Seriously, I'm not joking. This hasn't worked for like the entire day, and now it decides to post at 3333. I mean, well, hopefully we go into the OS and it shows some other issue. Let's see. Okay, CPU-Z, tell us all the bad news. The bad news is, yeah, I'm made to look like an idiot. It's probably not stable. I'm not even going to run like all the memory on this. We're just going to go through 33,000. And if we're lucky, it'll just spew out errors. There. So right off the bat, we already got an error. And as I said at the start of the video, one error is one error too many. Anyway, we'll stop that test. The funny thing is, even if you're throwing errors, like if you're doing competitive benchmarking, you can run ridiculously unstable memory settings through benchmarks, and your performance will actually keep increasing. The only risk with having a lot of memory errors in memtest is that the system crashes, which, you know, if you're doing competitive benchmarking, well, the occasional blue screen, you kind of get used to that. If you're overclocking for daily usage, you don't want to be seeing blue screens every couple hours, you know, or couple minutes, depending on, you know, how badly you dial in your memory settings. So, Yeah, either way, 3333 just worked. It's funny. Well, admittedly, I was trying to do 3333 with B-die before, and I kind of have a suspicion that this CPU doesn't like 16 gigs of memory, which is annoying. But yeah, it's just like huge amount of variance with memory overclocking. Oh, and here's the main reason why you'll want to use CPU Z for checking RAM frequency and not like, well, hardware info will do it too. But Ryzen timing checker only reports system memory multiplier. It doesn't report any BCLK adjustment. I don't think this will post if I try to do that, so we'll just drop down to 32x. Other than that, in terms of actual sort of crash recovery type deal thing with this motherboard, like what happens when you screw up your settings? Well, sometimes the motherboard will fail to post, boot loop a few times, and then it'll boot up and it'll set your memory multiplier to 2133. It won't actually wipe the BIOS. You'll keep your CPU. Actually, no. Well, on some CPUs, you'll keep your CPU clock. On this CPU right now, it'll actually trigger the 1.55 gigahertz bug, which is fun. Which somebody mentioned, it's called the multi-bug, and it's like, unless there's an official agency of naming bugs stupid things, then I'm calling it the 1.55 GHZ bug, because that's just as valid a description. Anyway, yeah, so as you can see, a Ryzen timing checker doesn't pick up on the BCLK increase, which, like, it's not supposed to. It's for checking timings, not memory frequency. And as it is, it provides more than enough functionality, in my opinion. So you will want that anyway. So let's restart. And in terms of crashing this board, so yeah, it'll sometimes reset the memory multiplier to 2133. When that happens, some CPUs will also experience the 1.55 gigahertz bug. That's not fun. How you solve that, like, it apparently varies from system to system, so I give up. I quite frankly give up as to, like, how on earth you should deal with that goes. But when your memory multiplier drops to 2133, all you need to do is go into the BIOS and change any memory setting, and your multiplier will go back up. So that's pretty cool. It's not, it's not like a huge issue. And in my opinion, because it doesn't drop, like, it doesn't lose all of your BIOS settings when it does that, I actually prefer that to the official Ryzen method of recovering from bad settings, where it'll fail to post 3 times in a row and then it'll wipe the BIOS. I don't like that, okay? Because, if you're dialing in a memory overclock, that's a lot of settings that, you potentially changed. And if the system resets on you, then yeah, you just lost a lot of work. Now, the way to get around that, of course, is to save profiles. But some of us forget to do that, like me. But when you're saving profiles, yeah, you can just save profiles right here. So you might go like 3260. And there. And you saved a profile, so if now the BIOS gets wiped, you can just go to the profiles and go load profile 3260. The thing is, one other issue this board has when crashing, which I've run into this once, okay, I've not had it happen twice or 3 times, I've had it happen once, very early on. The motherboard crashed hard, it wasn't recovering, and I got BIOS corruption. Luckily, being a Gigabyte motherboard, it has dual BIOS functionality. Though I should point out that BIOS corruption is something I've only ever experienced with Gigabyte motherboards. So I kind of suspect that Gigabyte puts their dual BIOS on, puts dual BIOS on all of their motherboards, basically because they know that their BIOS has a tendency to blow up badly. Either way, the board recovered. Backup BIOS did its thing, wrote over the main BIOS, which got corrupted. The problem with that is when that happens, it wipes all of your saved profiles. So you might want to save profiles onto a USB stick or a hard drive or something. So yeah, just keep that in mind. You might want to save your... Yeah, and the thing about the saving profiles onto HDDs and USB sticks is it needs them in FAT32. And I think you also need to use FAT32 for BIOS flashing. So if you have a Gigabyte motherboard, you might want to just have a FAT32 formatted hard drive just constantly plugged in with the backup of your well, that you use for BIOS flashing as well as storing profiles. But, you know, that's completely optional. Just if you want to store BIOS profiles, you're going to need a FAT32 formatted USB stick to do it, or a hard drive in that format, but, you know, that's kind of a waste of a hard drive in my opinion. And then, of course, you can take the profiles off the USB stick and store it onto your system drive, so you don't have to keep the USB stick in FAT32 all the time, but, you know, like, up to you how you manage that. So yeah, that's kind of unfortunate. Sometimes the board will just corrupt the BIOS. It will occasionally also just get stuck in boot loops. What else is there? I think that covers it. Like, it drops the multiplier. Sometimes it corrupts the BIOS. Sometimes it gets stuck in a boot loop. There's a reset. You know, I mentioned at the start, there's the reset pins. You can use those to reset the BIOS. So, yeah, I think I've covered everything. Profiles, crashing. Yeah, also, actually, one thing a few people might be wondering, which I just remembered, I really should have written a script. The problem is, I don't actually know what to put in a script. Like, whatever. Scripts aside, we need to finish this bloody video. It's already too long. The thing is, cold booting this motherboard has actually really impressed me, because this motherboard, you don't need to, I've not had to retrain memory once on this board. I've never retrained, which is really cool. I've never had a problem just booting a profile out of the box. And this, in comparison to, say, the ASRock's X370 Taichi board, on the Taichi, I literally, was setting up profiles where I had, profile 1, 3200 megahertz easy. Profile 2, 3200 megahertz medium. Profile 3, 3200 megahertz hard. Right? And it was basically because if I tried to, if the board reset itself and wiped all of its BIOS settings, right? I reset the board for whatever reason, bad settings or something. And then I go to profile 3 and I load up the really aggressive 3200 megahertz overclock on the memory, which would be by really aggressive, I mean, it was 3200 megahertz CL12, right? And it was at 1.7 volts on the memory. So I load up that profile, it doesn't work. So I'd have to go and load up 3200 easy and then go to 3200 hard. And sometimes that wouldn't work. So you'd go 3200 easy, 3200 medium, 3200 hard. And that board just requires that. And it's been getting better since, but it still does that more than this board. This board I can load up, assuming the CPU and the memory currently plugged in are capable of the profile, I can load it up and it'll run, which really, really impressive. I really appreciate that. That's awesome, because you can wipe the BIOS, you can wipe the board, and you're back up and running instantly, basically. So that's really nice in my opinion. I like that. Is there anything I'm forgetting at this point? I don't think so. I think we've covered everything there is to cover at this point. There's a lot to memory overclocking, but I think that is it for now. So, yeah. So, yeah, that is it. Okay, so that's it. That's everything you need, everything you should know about RAM overclocking, in my opinion, or at least everything you need to get started with RAM overclocking. There's a lot more to it. Well, actually, I don't know if there's a lot more to it, but because I suck at it. But I imagine there's more to it because I suck at it. Yeah, just don't try to copy settings out there somewhere. Don't try to copy somebody else's settings and assume they'll work. There's a lot of variants, chip to chip, memory to memory, and board to board. So, yeah, your mileage, it's not so much may vary, it's your mileage will vary. And I hope you found this helpful. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them down in the comments section below. You can like, share, subscribe. Now I already told you to leave a comment, so I can't do that for. Anyway, you can, if you'd like to help out with what I do here at actually hardcore overclocking. I have a PayPal, there's a Patreon, there's shirts. You can go find all of those under one link down in the description below. And I would like to thank Alza and Gigabyte for providing the Gigabyte motherboard here, as well as the Patreons for funding the memory. So yeah, because how else did I buy RAM? Anyway, that is it for the video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.